Good morning, class. Today we are going to start off the day by going over the elements of a plot diagram. So is anyone in the class familiar at all with what a plot diagram is and what the elements of plot are? Yeah, isn't plot just what makes up a story? Just like the different parts of the story. I know one of them is like climax or something, but isn't that just the story? Yeah, very good. The plot is the organized pattern or sequence of events that make up a story. So what you said just in teacher words. Every plot is made up of a series of incidents that are related to one another. They coincide, they go together, and that's what makes up a story. So basically we're just going to be talking today about the elements that create a story. So there are 5 parts of the plot diagram. I've passed out the graphic organizer to you guys so you can see that there's 5 areas on the organizer. The first one is the exposition, and that occurs in the beginning of the short story. The characters are introduced, and the setting is revealed, and the main conflict is also introduced. So the exposition is just the beginning part of the story. It can be long, it can be short, just giving you context of what's going to happen throughout the story. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. The second one is the rising action. This part starts developing the conflict or multiple conflicts if applicable. Interest builds, suspense occurs. The rising action can actually have multiple ups and downs. Some conflict can happen and be resolved, and then more conflict will happen and then maybe be resolved, but the main conflict is building suspense during this time in the rising action. Does that make sense to everyone? Does anyone have any questions about the rising action? Okay, cool. The third part of the plot diagram is the climax, and that's everyone's favorite part. That is the turning point of the story. The main conflict is faced, and the main character usually undergoes some sort of change, or main characters if there's multiple. So the climax is when everything is brought to a head and the story erupts or it changes, the people change. It's what the suspense has been building up to the entire time. The falling action is when all the loose ends of the plot are tied up, the conflict is resolved, everything is starting to make sense, everything is starting to lay out, conflict is resolved, and that's the main part of the falling action. And then the resolution is the final part when the story comes to a sensible ending. It's kind of difficult to identify the resolution and the falling action because they're pretty similar. The resolution is just typically very brief at the very end of the story. Not too hard. So does anyone have any questions about the 5 stages? So I'm going to say them again so you can fill them in on your graphic organizer all together. So number 1, does someone want to raise their hand and say what number 1 is? Yeah, number 1 is the exposition. Right, so number 1 is the exposition. Anyone want to raise their hand and say what the second one is? Yeah, number 2 is the rising action. Correct, number 2 is the rising action. I'll go ahead and give you number 3 since it's my favorite. That is the climax of the story, where everything builds up and the suspense is brought to a head. Anyone want to tell me what the 4th one is? Anyone have that written down or remember? Yeah, number 4 is the falling action. Yes, correct. Number 4 is the falling action. Very good. And the last one, anyone have that? Number 5 is the resolution. Correct. The last one is the resolution. So now that we all have that filled out on our charts, I'm going to read through the myth of Pandora's box. Some of you might have heard of it. Pandora is that type of the jewelry, the bracelets. People get Pandora bracelets and Pandora charms now. Greek mythology and Roman mythology, they're known for having implications in today's society now. Nike is, we won't get into it, but Nike is an example of that. Venus razors, like shaving razors, that's a Greek. Venus is a Greek goddess. So yeah, there's all sorts of different examples of where mythology is seen in today's society. I think you guys will like the story. It's pretty short. I'll try to read through it pretty quickly so you guys don't get bored. You have a handout of it on the back of your graphic organizer. So if you could just follow along while I read, and keep in mind what place it'll fall into on the plot diagram, because after I read it, we're going to go through, we're going to fill in where on the plot diagram each thing occurs. So I'm going to start off with a couple of questions for you guys. And these are rhetorical, so just be thinking about these while I'm reading. So, has your curiosity ever gotten you into any sort of trouble? Have you ever been so desperate to know a secret that you took no notice of a warning? Okay, and then another question would be, do you ever feel like you go to extensive measures to find out secrets that you may not need to know or you shouldn't know? Okay, cool. You guys just see the wires up there breaching together, and all right, I'm gonna start. In ancient Greece, there were two brothers named Epimetheus and Prometheus. They upset the gods and annoyed the most powerful of all gods, Zeus in particular. This was not the first time humans had upset Zeus, and once before, as punishment, he had taken from humans the ability to make fire. This meant they could no longer cook their meat and could not keep themselves warm. However, Prometheus was clever, and he knew that on the Isle of Lemnos lived Hephaestus, the blacksmith. He had a fire burning to keep his forge hot. Prometheus traveled to Lemnos and stole fire from the blacksmith. Zeus was furious and decided that humans had to be punished once and for all for their lack of respect. Zeus came up with a very cunning plan to punish the two brothers. With the help of Hephaestus, he created a woman from clay. The goddess Athena then breathed life into the clay. Aphrodite made her very beautiful, and Hermes taught her how to be both charming and deceitful. Zeus called her Pandora and sent her as a gift to Epimetheus. His brother Prometheus had warned him not to accept any gifts from the gods, but Epimetheus was completely charmed by the woman and thought Pandora was so beautiful that she could never cause any harm, so he agreed to marry her. Zeus, pleased that his trap was working, gave Pandora a wedding gift of a beautiful box. There was one very, very important condition, however, that she must never open the box. Pandora was very curious about the contents of the box, but she had promised that she would never open it. All she could think about was what could be in the box. She could not understand why someone would send her a box if she could not see what was in it. It seemed to make no sense at all, and she could think of nothing else but opening the box and unlocking its secrets. This was just what Zeus had planned. Finally, Pandora could stand it no longer. When she knew Epimetheus was out of sight, she crept up to the box, took the huge key off the high shelf, fitted it carefully into the lock, and turned it. But at the last moment, she felt a pang of guilt. Imagine how angry her husband would be, and quickly locked the box again without opening the lid and put the key back where she found it. 3 more times she did this until, at last, she knew she had to look inside or she would go completely mad. She took the key, slid it into the lock, and turned it. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and slowly lifted the lid of the box. She opened her eyes and looked into the box, expecting to see fine silks, gowns, or gold bracelets and necklaces, or even piles of gold coins. But there was no gleam of gold or treasure. There was no shining bracelets, and not one beautiful dress. The look of excitement on her face quickly turned to one of disappointment, and then horror, for Zeus had packed the box full of all the terrible evils he could think of. Outside the box poured disease and poverty. Out came misery, out came death, out came sadness, all shaped like tiny buzzing moths. The creatures stung Pandora over and over again, and she slammed the lid shut. Epimetheus ran into the room to see why she was crying in pain. Pandora could still hear a voice calling to her from the box, pleading with her to be let out. Epimetheus agreed that nothing inside the box could be worse than the horrors that had already been released, so they opened the lid once more. All that remained in the box was hope. It fluttered from the box like a beautiful dragonfly, touching the wounds created by the evil creatures and healing them. Even though Pandora had released pain and suffering upon the world, she had also allowed hope to follow them. Isn't that a great story, you guys? Okay, so it's one of my favorite Greek mythology stories. That's a simplified version of the actual whole long story, but it's a good version, and it's good for the activity we're about to complete. So now in your groups, get in groups of 3 of your choice, since you guys have been good while I was reading. Get in groups of 3 and go over the plot diagram and try to fill in the 5 elements in accordance with the story that we just created. So I'm going to be walking around, making sure everyone's understanding and getting it. I'm going to give you guys about 10 minutes to do that because it shouldn't take too terribly long. The story was very short, and you have a copy of it on the other side of your plot diagram. So just go through and fill it in where you can. I'll be walking around in about 10 minutes. I'll stop you guys and we'll go over it as a class. Awesome.